The Tennessee Titans can absolutely shock the world, but it comes down to one man, and that man is William Donovan Levis. Now, obviously, there are a lot of other factors when it comes to this, but we can be honest with ourselves and say that Will Levis is the biggest factor. This roster is absolutely stacked from top to bottom. It just only comes down to how the quarterback plays. But there are obviously other factors to the Tennessee Titans being a successful roster and other big things. So let's get into the nitty-gritty and talk about everything that has to factor into the Titans being a real contender this year. Starting out, obviously, we have to talk about the man himself, Will Levis. Now, I know I've talked about him extensively on this channel, and I even talked about him in a specific episode talking about his story and how he became a Tennessee Titan, and now he is the future of the Tennessee Titans. But obviously, he's the biggest factor. I mean, I don't think there's any hiding that. Like, he is going to take this team either to a 7-10 record, or he's going to bring this team to like an 11-6 record. There is no in between here. So, obviously, he is the biggest factor. But then again, there are a lot of other factors. And obviously, like I said, he can be the biggest one, but that is mostly just because of the fact that he has such an amazing supporting cast around him. Like, for example, we've obviously got to talk about the receivers first. Now, the receiver core, some people are going to tell you that it's completely horrible, everybody in there is washed, and that there is no way that actually helps Will Levis. But when we look at it, he has two 1,000-yard receivers with him, and one that wasn't even used properly and was coming off of a single-year suspension. That should be Calvin Ridley. He was the biggest addition in the offseason. Well, second biggest, but we'll get to the biggest later. Now, my thing about Calvin Ridley is that he wasn't used properly. He had just come off of a full-year suspension, so I feel like that there's a lot of room for improvement for him. He's physically young, and he's got a lot of things going for him, and I think he will be the Titans receiver one for how long his contract is for the next 4 years. Now, obviously, we've got to talk about the other receiver, DeAndre Hopkins. Yes, he's old, but he still has production left in him, and even if he is a little washed, that still doesn't mean that this receiver core cannot be successful, because he will be a decent wide receiver too, at the very least. And obviously, the big guy, new kid on the block, Tyler Boyd. He is a great slot receiver. Let me tell you, he has been number one in almost every statistical category for the slot receiver position. So, in my opinion, that should mean that this receiver core is going to be pretty loaded. But there are obviously other things that we got to talk about, like the offensive line. Now, this is obviously a make or break type of deal. This is the third biggest factor that the Titans have for this season. If Latham is a bust and the offensive line doesn't play well, then that obviously means Levis isn't going to have protection. He may very well end up getting injured, and we'll never know if he was actually the guy or not. So that is obviously a big factor. But obviously, we got to talk about Latham. Latham is an absolute mammoth of a man. Let me tell you, he is huge. But he obviously is a little bit raw. But I think pairing him up with Bill Callahan is the best move that this Titans roster could have made. Let's take a look at this. He is kind of raw, like I said. So let's think about the fact that since he is raw, he gets paired up with one of the best offensive line coaches of all time. That is the perfect matchup for him. It is a match made up in heaven. So obviously, there's Skronsky. He's solid. He's consistent. I have no worries about him having a second year and being absolutely amazing this year and potentially being in contention for an all-pro spot. I'm also not worried about Lloyd Cushenberry because he is also an offensive line beast. But I am a little worried about the right side. I think that Dylan Radins will be okay at right guard, But what are we doing at right tackle? I have some faith in Nicolas Petit-Frere, but that does not mean that you shouldn't bring in someone else to compete with him for that job. So, overall, offensive line is a big factor, but we've also got to talk about the fact that this could end up being the make or break, even if Levis is good. But there are obviously other people that we can point at. Obviously, there is one more factor that we've got to go over right after this, but I'm just going to talk about this right now. The cornerback room is absolutely loaded, and the rest of the defense is the fourth biggest factor. Can Elijah Molden produce, or if we bring in an old vet, can he keep the secondary stable? Can he help that defense go to the next level? And can Tavondre Sweat be an absolute beast that can absorb all double teams and open up room for Big Jeff Simmons? Let's see. I think that if this defense can play well, this team will be fine, whether Levis is not that great or if he's really good. Obviously not if he's hot garbage. But we've also got to talk about the other defensive end. What are we doing at the other defensive end? The Arden Key is not the best guy that we can go get. We got to go get someone else. So that is another big factor. But we've obviously got to get into the final factor, a.k.a. the biggest factor of them all outside of Will Levis. The coaching staff is absolutely key for this next year's Tennessee Titans team. Now, obviously, we've got a lot of confidence in them. Some of the dudes are even proven, like Bill Callahan, one of the greatest offensive line coaches in the NFL history and maybe even in the history of the sport itself. But obviously, not everybody else is a guarantee on that coaching staff. Like, for example, Brian Callahan, his son, is the head coach of the team. He didn't call plays in Cincinnati, and he was more of the second man to Zach Taylor up in Cincinnati. So we've got to see how he plays out. Now, obviously, I think he's going to be great, but I got to see it to believe it. People also thought Nathaniel Hackett was going to be great. So let's think about that for a second. Let's also talk about the defensive coordinator. Denard Wilson is an amazing coach, especially a defensive backs coach. But we have no clue what he's like as a defensive coordinator. He could very well be the worst defensive coordinator in the NFL, and we just don't know it yet. Now, do I think that's true? Not even a little bit. I think he's going to be one of the best defensive coordinators by the end of the year. But that does not mean that he could very well end up being bad as well. And Nick Foles is basically what Brian Callahan was to Zach Taylor last year. So I'm not too worried about that guy. But the rest of the staff, I am a little concerned about. And that's going to do it for this video. Now, I want to know what y'all think of this, because, I tried to revitalize the format that I did for, a Levis video back a while ago, if y'all remember that. And I want to see if y'all are okay with me, continuing to do this type of format. So if you want to see my last podcast episode for any new viewers, that will be somewhere on one of these two sides. Same thing with the subscribe button. But anyway, that's going to do it all for me. This has been a rundown of your Tennessee Titans. I love y'all, and tighten up.